Hi, good afternoon, and welcome to our discussion on political risk and Mexico's investment climate. I'm Andrew Redmond. I'm the director of the Mexico Institute at the Wilson Center, and it's my pleasure to welcome you all this afternoon. In response to U.S.-China economic competition and the lessons learned from the COVID pandemic about supply chain resilience and the risks of overdependence on a single supplier across an ocean, Mexico has seen a boom in foreign direct investment. In 2023, Mexico received $36 billion in foreign direct investment from firms in the US, Europe, and Asia in a range of sectors. Mexico also passed China to become the US's #1 trading partner for the first time in 2 decades. But 75% of that FDI came in the first half of 2023, and much of the FDI was reinvested profits rather than greenfield investment. So while Mexico is clearly well positioned to capitalize on the nearshoring boom, the next president will face certain challenges and obstacles that must be addressed to build on the 2023 figures. To assess the political risk of investment in Mexico and to explore the investment climate more broadly, we've assembled a fantastic panel of expert analysts and investors this afternoon who will engage in what I think will be a really spirited and interesting conversation. I'm delighted to turn things over to today's moderator, Financial Times Mexico and Central America correspondent Christine Murray. Christine assumed her current position after almost 10 years at Reuters and the Thomson Reuters Foundation in London, New York, and Mexico City. She's covered beats from companies to human trafficking and is now focused on stories about politics and economics in the region, and actually joins us from Tapachula, a place, Christine, I'm not sure we've had a moderator join us from that particular location, certainly not in a while. So thanks for being here, and I'm going to turn things over to you.
Thank you, Andrew. I'm Christine Murray, the Mexico and Central America correspondent for the Financial Times. And I'll be moderating this fantastic panel of experts on the state of play of things in Mexico right now and what might happen going forward. Throughout the panel, you can send your questions through the chat or via Twitter or X to @MexicoInstitute and to the email mexicoinstitute@wilsoncenter.org. So our panel today is made up of Carlos Ramirez, partner at political consultants Integralia Consultores, Professor Guadalupe Correa-Cabrera, professor at the Schar School of Policy and Government at George Mason University, and Harry Krensky, the founder of private capital fund Discovery Americas. And to kick us off, Carlos will give us his overview of the situation. Carlos.
Thank you, Christine. Good afternoon to you all, and very happy to be here. Thank you to the Wilson Center for organizing this fantastic event, and very happy to share views with colleagues. And certainly this is going to be a great panel. So let me, I have 2 slides just to put a little bit of context into this event. Integralia publishes every year for the past 6 years, has been publishing a report on political risk in Mexico at the beginning of each one. And we published ours in January. By the way, it is open to, you can download it. And in there, we basically put out our views on political risk in the country. Before going very briefly into that, let me move. Sorry, I don't know why this is not moving. So some general disclaimers before moving into the overall 10 risks. I'm not going to go each one by one, but certainly I'll provide you with some ideas of what are the main issues that we want to highlight. The disclaimers, I don't know why this is not moving. Sorry for this, but anyway. So what are the disclaimers we want to highlight before moving into the main risks? One, political risk is usually underestimated. We've been doing a lot of the same things and political risks, doing it for more than 15 years. And what we always find is that companies, investors tend to ignore or underestimate what political risk is and what are the political risk situation in the country. This is normal. There are other risks that are probably more important: financial risk, operational risk, security risk. But that is our experience, underestimation of political risk. Second, what we always find also is that people tend to think that because there is political risk, that means that we are necessarily bearish with the country. And that not necessarily is the case. There can be countries, and there are experiences around the world, where you can have high political risk, but still very interesting opportunities in terms of investment. That is also something to highlight. And the third one and final is that political risk in Mexico right now is you need to focus granularly on each of the sectors and identify what is the political risk of each of the sectors in the economy, because it is very different. There is a lot of heterogeneity between the political risk that you find in mining, for example, or in energy, and the political risk that you find in technology or the financial sector. So having said that, let me just go back and talk a little bit about the three basic issues that we highlight in the report. So there are 10 risks, three main aspects that we find important to raise in 2024, an election year. The first one has to do with political risks related to political institutions, particularly institutions that have been very significant counterbalances during the past 5 years, institutions that since Mexico's transition to democracy in 1997 were redesigned and basically have been a significant pillar of Mexican democracy. We are talking about the Supreme Court, the Electoral Institute, and diverse autonomous institutions, the Competition Commission, the Transparency Institute, among others. Those institutions we highlight are today at relatively high risk for different reasons, but mainly, for example, the Supreme Court. There are 11 members in the court, and right now the court is split between two groups. 8 members are relatively independent, 3 are basically pro-government, and the next president of Mexico will be able to choose several, but next in December of this year, we'll be able to choose one more member of the Supreme Court, which, if at the end of the day is someone close to the incumbent government and the incumbent party, that will mean, in essence, that the Supreme Court will not be able to declare unconstitutional any of future legislative bills that could be on this situation. And there's also 18 constitutional reforms presented by President López Obrador on the 5th of February, basically that challenges these institutions and want to basically change them entirely. Those institutions, again, the Supreme Court, the Electoral Institute, and the autonomous institutions in Mexico, if the government is able to change the Constitution and redesign Mexico's political institutions, Mexican democracy would end up being very different of what we see today. Basically, counterbalances would be diminished, and certainly this will have implications for the business community, because there will be a lot of concentration of power in the presidency and very little checks and balances on the president. The second topic, and I'll move fast, the second topic which we raise in the presentation has to do with security. And there are 2 areas where we are particularly concerned. One that has to do with criminal organization taking advantage of the election and expanding their control on local markets and territories. We have seen this on every political cycle in Mexico, either the presidential election or the midterm elections, in which criminal organizations take advantage of, let's say, the disruptions that the election brings, and that leads to more violence, to more capture of local markets. That has been something we have been highlighting for the past 5 years. And that obviously leads to more risk for companies and more risk for individuals. That is one of the top risks of this year. And the other one has to do with militarization. Militarization meaning this government has basically brought a lot of attention because it has put the militaries, the armed forces in charge of many activities that used to be civil activities and now are being occupied by the military. Finally, a third pillar of our political risk analysis have to do with the economy. Two risks that we highlight for 2024. One has to do with the US. We are certainly worried about a return of Donald Trump into the presidency. In the report, we highlight several aspects. We are worried of a Donald Trump very aggressive against Mexico because of migration, the security situation, and the trade relation between Mexico and the US, we think, could be not at risk in the sense of canceling the USMCA as it happened in 2016, where Donald Trump clearly threatened Mexico for almost 2 years of doing that. But certainly the trade situation between both countries would be in a frictious situation. And finally, last word on this, the fiscal situation of the Mexican government clearly is the new president, whoever she is, will inherit a very tough situation in terms of very limited maneuver room from a fiscal standpoint and very difficult choices to take. What to do with Pemex, how to invest the relatively low levels of income, of government income, and a lot of promises that we are already seeing in the very early stages of the campaign. So overall, and I will cut it here, this is a report that tries to highlight what are the political risk situation in the country. Does not necessarily mean that there are no opportunities. Actually, there are a lot of good opportunities, and we're going to hear about them. But certainly, our work at Integralia is raise those issues, and we hope that this is helpful for everyone. Thank you very much, Christine. Back to you.
Thank you very much, Carlos, for outlining some of those key risks as you see them around institutions, the economy, the US relationship. But I'd love to turn to Harry and hear your perspective, Harry, on how you think about these risks as an investor.
Sure. Thanks, Christine, and thanks to the Wilson Center for inviting us. And Carlos, thank you for setting the table. So for those of you who haven't read Carlos's report, I think you should read the whole report. It's a pretty scary report. I'm going to try to convince Carlos with my remarks that I don't underestimate the political risks of Mexico. And after you hear what I say, Carlos may disagree with that assessment. I want to tailor my remarks a little bit, and I want to focus on some of the areas where Carlos and I may have slight disagreements to make this more interesting. And I want to just remind people, Carlos is a professional political commentator and analyst, and I'm not. I think different perspectives are good. And I want to share my perspectives. Before I start, I just want to remind people the views I'm sharing are my personal views. They are not views of Discovery Americas necessarily, and they're certainly not the views of any of the public companies in Mexico that I serve on the board. And talking about perspectives, I think it's always important to think about perspectives in terms of relative perspective. So sequentially comparing where we were and where we're going is always important, and comparing on a relative basis to other places in the world. As an investor, you know, that's what we have to do. We have to choose between different things. Just a little bit of background on myself to help frame these remarks. I've been investing in Mexico for 35 years now. I've invested in pretty much every asset class in Mexico. This is going to be my 7th sexennial. I still have a track record of not doing very well in picking who the next president is. I think I'm 0 for all of them. And during this time, I've also been able to invest in about 30 other countries around the world, in Latin America, in the Middle East, in Asia, Africa. And that gives me some other terms of perspective, and I'm living in the United States right now, and that also gives me some other perspective. In addition, I've been able to start 5 companies in Mexico that also helps me give me a different perspective. I helped start an airline called Volaris. I helped start a trucking and logistics business that's now called Traxion. A K through 12 education platform called Merited, a hospital chain called HMAS, and of course, Discovery America. So I'm talking today not as an economist or a political commentator, but as an entrepreneur who's experienced upfront some of these political risks, and also as an investor. So now let's share my views. And I think this is another important disclosure. I'm incredibly bullish about Mexico. And again, I need to make sure I'm not underestimating the political risk, and I'm taking careful notes of what Carlos is telling us. But in recent years, I've been an outspoken bull on Mexico, on its economy, on its financial markets, and this secular trend of nearshoring. And I have to say, the upcoming elections has always been the weak spot. It's always been the area that's left me the most uneasy and uncomfortable, and always wanting to check to make sure that's right, that still fits with the commentary. And in preparation for this, so I didn't want to look foolish talking alongside Carlos, I had about 20 meetings over the last couple of weeks with different political commentators, including the presidential candidates. And I want to share, you know, what I learned in those and what I'm thinking. And the short conclusion is my fears about the election and the political risk in Mexico are going down. I'm becoming more bullish and more certain of the nearshoring opportunity. So as regards to the political risks that Carlos has mentioned, I'm going to carefully watch all of them. I look at them and I think about all of them. I think my take may be a bit more optimistic on the impact of some of those and the outcomes. But let me share my general views very quickly and the things that worry me most about Mexico. First, I want to talk about the candidates for president for Mexico. I believe Mexico is extremely blessed to have a choice between Claudia Sheinbaum and Xochitl Gálvez. In my opinion, both are women of character, of integrity, and are honest people. They're also women of science who use that framework for decision-making and are very thoughtful. As policymakers, they have different recipes for Mexico. And a lot of people focus on those different recipes. But I believe both deeply care about what is best for Mexico and its people. And that's a choice that few other countries in the world are enjoying this year. About half of the people in the world are going to vote for new leaders, and they don't have that choice. In the United States, 50% of us don't think the right choice is to have a choice between Donald Trump and Joe Biden. And if we had a choice between Claudia Sheinbaum and Xochitl Gálvez, we would be much happier than what we have right here. So I think we just need to realize that and put it in perspective, and that in some ways the elections in Mexico don't matter as much as we've been thinking about them. The second thing that I think is very positive is the macro environment is going to be incredibly favorable to these candidates. Nearshoring will deliver higher growth, higher real wages, especially among the lowest income and the lower middle income populations that Morena is very focused on. There's going to be better fiscal outcomes, more investment, a stronger peso, stronger balance of payments, and this is going to forgive a multitude of sins. And so I think this is a really good background for both of them. That being said, I think there's many things to worry about. Of all the things that Carlos mentioned, the thing that I worry the most about is security outside of Mexico City. The strategy of abrazos, no balazos is a failed strategy. And it's been for the last two sexenios. We didn't call it that before this sexenio, but that's more or less what we had in previous sexenios. Fentanyl is not a US problem only. And just as like the guns coming from the US to Mexico is not a Mexico problem. And there needs to be more cooperation between the countries and a different approach from policymakers. Colombia, which I've spent many years investing in, is a roadmap which shows us that there are good things that can happen if we take care of these things correctly, and there's bad things that can happen if we don't take care of that. And as I mentioned, security outside of Mexico City has been the real problem. Mexico City is actually a pretty good security outcome, and I think we can give former Mayor Claudia Sheinbaum a lot of credit for that. I'd also remind us that there is a middle ground before we get to Balazo. Felipe Calderon's policies at the end of his administration were working. It's messy, it makes for bad press and bad articles by people like Christine, but it does positively impact the situation. The other thing on the fiscal side that Carlos mentioned, I worry most about Pemex. Pemex has over $100 billion of debt. 90 billion of Mexican government support has gone into Pemex since 2019. About 50 of that has been direct support. We see declining production over many years. It continues to lose money. And if Morena is successful as Claudia Sheinbaum, she wants to move to alternative energy sources, which is going to further hurt Pemex. And there are solutions available. The challenge is there was one person in the last administration that did not, in the current administration, that didn't want to listen to the solutions. Even the unions were supportive of that. In my experience in Mexico, if you can get the unions on board, that should be the hardest thing. And we haven't been able to do that. And it will be a challenge for Claudia to make that pivot, but it's a pivot that she needs to make. Also, on the micro versus the macro, I've been outspoken that the macro under AMLO has been very, very positive, much more than everybody expected. But the micro has been an unmitigated disaster. For those of us that do business in the aviation sector, or those who are involved in the energy sector, there's been a real challenge there by policies that are not well thought out. And I think each of the incoming presidents need to rethink the decisions there. And then finally, what I like to say is, we need to judge a person by the company that they keep. And I will be watching closely, especially if Claudia Sheinbaum is elected president, about the people she surrounds herself with in key positions and who is lurking in the shadows, which will give me more cause for concern depending on who is there. In concluding, I believe the investment outlook for the next sexenio is very, very good. It has an ability to be incredible. I'm all in. I'm watching carefully the political risk indicators that Carlos highlighted to make sure that those things don't change. But for now, I'm extremely constructive and positive. Back to you, Christine.
Thanks, Harry, for that more bullish case on Mexico, outlining some of the key risks as you see them around security and Pemex. And so it's a good moment to turn to Guadalupe, who is an expert on security. So Guadalupe, from your perspective, how do you think about the risks over the next few years?
Great. Thank you very much, Christine. Thank you very much, the Mexico Institute, for organizing this very important panel, because this is what we should be talking about. First of all, I would like to congratulate Integralia, Carlos, of course, for putting together, and the team, for putting together this very interesting and also professional report. With very clear methodology, with a very, concrete analysis. And I see these risks as real risks. These are the risks right now: political risks and economic risks, related to the politics of Mexico in a time of presidential elections. Is an excellent document. I didn't see the document so negative, but I think that some of the risks, in my perspective, are not as important, or should be reframed in many ways. I agree with Harry, and I agree with the fact that no matter how difficult the situation is, and this is the biggest risk for Mexico, the security situation in the country, no matter how bad it has been during this sexennium and the other two sexenniums, Mexico had advanced to become the first trading partner with the United States of America. And of course, the circumstances are helping Mexico, as Harry said. The reconfiguration of the supply chain, which is the key thing here. And here we're talking about a party that's very pragmatic, and also investors that are pragmatic. And as we know, there are regions where armed conflict is happening, and they still invest. And here, because of the reconfiguration of supply chains, and of course, all this idea of nearshoring, Mexico is going to do well in the economy. However, this concern and this risk about the concentration of power, particularly that have to do with institutions, the Supreme Court, also that will be controlled by Morena, and the lack of checks and balances. This is coming, and right now we have a party that has had the capacity to impose its project. We only have one political project in Mexico. We don't have a political project of the opposition, in my perspective, or they have not been able to articulate one that could really contest the power of the current party and the current political project that is there and probably will continue according to the polls. And absolutely, there's going to be concentration of power. What is really happening here is that we're not in the 1990s, and the concerns about democracy are very different. And investors are going to invest in Mexico no matter what. The reconfiguration of supply chains are gonna make this happen. I agree completely with Harry. At the same time, the Morena Party and also Claudia Sheinbaum have proven to be extremely pragmatic, accepting all members of all parties that they can. They're very, very pragmatic. They want unity. And the thing here is that we are going backwards, but backwards because probably what Mexicans want is what they had during the PRI. Morena is becoming the new PRI, for sure, with different colors. Like they have the color of the flag, and now we have the purple color of Morena. And this is something that gives stability, or has given stability, or gave stability to Mexico during a number of decades, of course, in the decline of the 71 years of the PRI. But this is probably what the people want. People are, the majority of the people are supporting the president and its process of militarization, which I see as the biggest risk here. But if abrazos no balazos don't work, and if balazos work, we don't have the same president today. We're going to have Claudia. Claudia is probably going to have a different approach to investors, to the foreign sector, and we don't know how this is going to use the military. I don't see a way back to to police reform. I see the militarization staying there. The interesting thing about this report is that it really laid out the themes that we need to be talking about. About the pragmatism of Claudia and her capacity. And I'm talking about Claudia because of how I see the situation, how I consider who has a political project and the possibilities of this project to continue and to be refurbished, which I think this is going to happen. This is something important. For solving the problem of security, you have to solve the gridlock and the problems between, or the lack of coordination between the federal and state governments. We're going to have Morena everywhere. The country is going to be painting with the color of Morena. And so this is going to take out the gridlock and will help to solve the problems. We don't know if the abrazos are going to continue. Maybe there's going to be more mano dura. We don't really know who Claudia is going to select as her next, as her next strong man. We don't know if she's going to be continuing governing with the military, might be, but at the same time, we don't really know about that. That's kind of in the air. And so I can say that for investors, they are going to continue investing in Mexico. Mexico has really, challenges in terms of security. Absolutely, we are extending the capacity of different groups. There is a complete disorganization, but also there are possibilities that this is going to be solved in a different way because of different leadership. Donald Trump is going to also be a game changer here, and they're going to be very important if Donald Trump gets elected, of course. But the possibility that if he gets elected, there's going to be more pressure for mano dura policies. And Donald Trump is seen by Mexico as a real threat, but as you remember, in terms of foreign policy, and not just you remember, in terms of foreign policy, governments maintain some type of stability. And that was proven, notwithstanding the narrative, but the relationship of Andrés Manuel López Obrador with Donald Trump was extremely stable, as it is today. So overall, I believe that that the opportunities are greater than the challenges. And there are two big things that are challenging for Mexico. And this is the fiscal reform problem. Of course, Pemex, Mexico needs a fiscal reform. And that is the biggest challenge probably, and the debt. Because investments are coming, Plan Sonora is coming, Claudia understands very well the need to continue being part of the international community more than anybody else. The transition toward renewables economy, she understands this is going to happen. She understands, and she's going to move forward with Plan Sonora, and this is going to be a very interesting political time. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Guadalupe. Lots of very important points there. I think it would be good to go a little deeper in security. And one question, I think, Harry, it'd be great if you could take this one, but is some parts of the country with the highest homicide rates actually concentrate quite a lot of investment. And there's kind of a sense that some companies manage to insulate themselves from the problem of insecurity. So why, from your perspective, is it an investor problem? Help us understand how insecurity does or potentially could affect investors.
So I'm going to invoke the spirit of Carlos Ramirez and say the following. Foreign investors many times underestimate the political risks until they escalate to a certain point. So what do I mean? First of all, nearshoring is a trend, whether it's going to be in the mild, strong, or medium form that is going to persist for a very long time. And out of issues unrelated to Mexico, and frankly, despite some of the policies of the last administration, nearshoring is coming to Mexico out of necessity. And there could be a much different, better outcome if we focus on policies related to that. So they're there. and it doesn't mean that there's not insecurity. And what I would also say is, I moved my family to Mexico in 2009 for a couple of years. And that was during call it the Balazo phase of it. And my wife, the first time she came to Mexico City, she expected to see gunfire over our heads because all of the media outlets on a daily basis were feeding us a stream of violence. And now, in part because the media is less interested in it, but in part because the policy objectives of the current administration is, let's have a deal. And I'm not saying there's a formal deal, but there's an implicit deal. We'll leave you alone. Don't make a big mess. And that's what we're seeing. I lived in a first apartment in New York City, and we had a cockroach problem. Every apartment, we didn't have an especially bad one. And when you went to kill the cockroaches and you put out poison, you saw them. And when you left them alone, you turn on a light and you go in 2 minutes later, you didn't see them. And we've been taking a collective approach to this. That doesn't mean that the situation isn't bad and there's risk and businesses are managing the risk. There is a tipping point, however, which I think we are fast approaching, that if we have too many areas of the country that are less manageable, one day we're going to wake up and people are going to say, you know what? I'm not moving my family to certain regions of the country where they're setting up factories. We're going to have to either find another place. So I don't think this is good news. I think this is really bad news. I think, it's politicians by nature like taking things that have costs way down the road past their terms and getting the benefits right now. And that's, and again, and I don't want to blame it all on the current administration. The administration before this, which was not a Moraine administration, took the exact same approach and said, let's not deal with this now. And we're going to pay a price. So I think companies are not as aware of it as they should. I think they have to be here to a certain extent. And we are going to get close to a point where they're going to rethink that based solely on this issue.
Thanks, Harry. And I mean, I would think it would be good to look at what are the candidates proposing. Carlos, would you be able to kind of outline what the differences or contrast the potential security policies of President Sheinbaum or Galvez?
Yeah. So Sheinbaum has brought her project, and actually there's a document that she published during the weekend, very detailed on what she would do if she wins, which is today the highest probability. And basically, I would say that the main differences, Sheinbaum had a relatively successful tenure here in Mexico City as mayor regarding security, right? Although there are some discussions about the data, there's some controversies about the data. At the end of the day, the reality, I live in Mexico City, and we've experienced certainly an improvement. The question is, what Sheinbaum offers is basically to reproduce the model of Mexico City in the entire country. The big question here is if Mexico City model of security is something that can be repeated everywhere in the country. We tend to think that no, but overall, that's what she's going to try to do. Bring more technology, pay more policemen, increase the number of people in the streets, policemen in the streets. Certainly, she talks a lot about social programs, attending the problem since the origin. She basically has a relatively close view to what López Obrador and the abrazos no balazos, but with a difference in the sense that probably she thinks that it's not enough to just hand social programs, that you need something more in order to have an improvement. The big question again is if she's going to be able to have enough money, and the capacities at a state level are very, very different from the ones that you have in Mexico City. Now, Xochitl Gálvez, her approach there is not that different from the Sheinbaum's model, in the sense that she talks a lot about technology. She talks a lot about, obviously, improving the police forces everywhere. She talks about multiplying by 3 or 4 the number of effectives of the National Guard. I mean, in that sense, there's not much difference with Sheinbaum. Probably the difference, not as clear, is that there seems to be in Xochitl Gálvez a view that you have to go after the bad guys. You cannot allow the criminals to slowly start to permeate and take advantage and basically take some territories in the country. Right now, I mean, certain territories, Guerrero, Michoacán, Zacatecas, there are some part of Jalisco, areas where basically the criminal organizations are the ones that rule. I think that the difference between both of them is that Xochitl thinks that she needs to go after the bad guys more than Sheinbaum thinks that that should be done. So I would leave it there, but yeah, basically those are the differences between them.
I think we lost Christine for a moment. We're going to try to get her reconnected. Just to pick up on that, maybe Guadalupe, I don't know if you had any thoughts on the two security strategies of the leading candidates, if you had any thoughts on where they might differ between each other or be a change from what AMLO has been doing.
Yeah, I think it's a great question and a great answer by Carlos. Basically, the two candidates have very similar approaches. This, focus on surveillance, to solve the problems that have not been solved, to add to what has been done, which is the militarization, basically, and the creation of the National Guard, because both understand that the National Guard needs to be there still. And unfortunately, there's not I would have expected that the opposition would have a better frame or better grain alternative to what we have right now, a real police reform that would take eventually the military outside the street. I have not heard concrete steps to do that from Xochitl Gálvez and her team. Unfortunately, also, the situation in Mexico of security, I didn't want to underplay it in my first remarks because I was focusing only on the report. But this is a very serious problem that is not going to be solved by, providing resources for the youth. And this was basically the approach of the current president. The abrazos no balazos, the militarization not effective, going after the bad guys, as Carlos says, or like Xochitl Gálvez is saying, but solving this problem in a comprehensive way. And I have not seen that from the opposition, but Claudia supposedly has that idea in mind. On paper, it looks it looks good, this approach that needs to be comprehensive. But in reality, the effectiveness, I am not sure. Solving the problem of corruption. This is a major thing, particularly because of the involvement of several actors that are connected with organized crime themselves, that are part of the Morena party, that are part of the current establishment, and this is a key thing. If we don't find corruption and impunity, things are not going to be solved. So solving the root cause is important, but it's a long-term strategy. And none of them seem to be aware or to have the capacity. And with the structure of Morena right now, this situation is not going to be solved. There's no plan for a real police reform. There's no plan of how really to solve the problem because what has been done. But Claudia is not going to be able to apply the same model that she applied in Mexico City. How is she going to solve the situation in Sonora, in Zacatecas, in Guerrero, in a number of states of Mexico, like all the border? I don't see a plan, and it's very complicated. But with that being said, investors under the current, of the current context would probably find more opportunities and challenges. This is a challenge for Mexicans. This is a challenge for the poor communities of Mexico. And I don't think that the two candidates have put together a plan or have the capacity and have tried to see how they are going to get the resources to solve the problem. Fiscal reform is a central reform for the country. Thank you.
Thanks, Guadalupe. Apologies for my internet connection. You mentioned corruption there, Guadalupe, and I think it would be a good pivot to the question of institutions in the country, and in particular, the future of the judiciary, which has been under a lot of pressure under this government, and they proposed a major reform to the judiciary. I'd like to start perhaps with you, Carlos, in terms of what is the state of the judiciary in Mexico more broadly, not just the specific proposals on the table, and what kinds of problems are the most important for Mexicans and for investors in the country?
Yes. So the judicial system in Mexico, I mean, you need to see this theme in two basic broad areas. One is the Supreme Court in itself, that has served as a very significant counterbalance during the present administration. And I think even before in past administrations, was a relatively important counterbalance to presidential, executive, and legislative decisions. And in that sense, has consolidated as a very significant, important institution to, let's say, for the rule of law. I mean, there is certainly a lot of controversy behind what I just said. Some people think that this hasn't happened in reality. AMLO, one of them, right? And that the Supreme Court has been captured for a long time. And that's why he is proposing, at the end of the day, to talk very openly, to capture the Supreme Court and nominate the ministers through an electoral process, through an electoral process that in which people basically select the ministers, and that, in the view of López Obrador and Claudia Sheinbaum, which she has said that she supports this, that will bring a Supreme Court closer to the people. We as political scientists see this clearly as an intention to capture the Supreme Court and basically dismantle the check and balance that has been for the past years or so. The other part of the judicial sector is more messy, right? That has to do with procurement, with all that, the decisions that judges take in a day-by-day basis. Clearly, here is Mexico is suffering a huge, we have a long history of underdevelopment of our judicial system that hasn't been solved. And clearly there's insatisfaction with that among Mexicans. So that, politically speaking, from a president that has been very powerful, that allows him to talk to Mexicans and say, we need to change this because this is not working. So again, the question is, does the judicial, and I'll end up here, the judicial sector in Mexico needs reform? Definitely, definitely. But we should not lose ground on what are the real intentions from López Obrador regarding the Supreme Court, and why is he proposing the reform he is proposing.
And Harry, how big an issue is the state of the judiciary in Mexico for investors who are investing now?
Yeah, so this is time always is, as I mentioned at the beginning, being here for 35 years in Mexico, from the early 90s till about 12 years ago, I was very optimistic about certain changes in Mexico, and I thought those changes were more permanent in nature, related to the judiciary and the levels of corruption within government. And I thought, wow, we just have to wait 12 more years. I would say the last two administrations have shattered that theory in terms of sequential improvement. Doing business in Mexico continues to have problems. There's something in the US called the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, which limits Americans' ability to do bad things in other countries. And if that country won't punish them, the US government will punish them. And you see, we have to manage our compliance with that all the time and make sure that companies that we're involved in are strictly adhering to that policy. And the fact that we have to spend so much time on there is unfortunate. There was 1 week we had a company that provide lending to the real estate industry, and 1 week I was told I can't come down to Mexico because we had foreclosed on a property, and the people that we foreclosed on were using the criminal legal system as a tool to try to stop us from foreclosing. And you look more recently, one of our competitors, Advent International, sold a business, and the legal system was used in a way that was very unfortunate to solve a commercial dispute. So it's something that is still problematic. It has not improved as much as I would have hoped it would have improved over 35 years. But I would have to agree with Carlos. I think we just have to be careful what we're trading for, what we're trading for. I think again, I have a hard time standing in judgment of any other country when our Supreme Court has its own challenges about some of these same topics. But judicial checks and balances are a good thing, and I think weakening those checks and balances are bad. Under a Sheinbaum administration, I worry a lot less about not having checks and balances than I do under an AMLO administration, frankly. But we should still want to have those checks and balances in place.
Mexico's, institutions, there is a narrative in parts of the private sector in Mexico that Mexico's institutions have kind of resisted different attempts in the last few years to weaken them, from Banco de Mexico to INE and the Supreme Court as well. How do you think about that narrative, Guadalupe? And do you think that the risk to these institutions going forward is only present if the ruling coalition gets a supermajority in Congress, or is there are there all risks in the middle scenario where maybe there isn't a supermajority for the ruling coalition, but a strong, simple majority in Congress?
That's basically what's going to define the path that we're going to follow in terms of the evolution of our institutions. And this is key. This is key. If this supermajority by the ruling coalition is achieved in this process, we're going to see massive institutional change in the country. As I said, Morena is the new PRI, and we're going to go back to that scenario for sure, for sure. But again, that scenario gave the country stability for a number of decades, not the 71 years, but for a number of decades. Probably this is what's going to happen, but we'll see, because the process, the electoral campaigns are just starting. Well, supposedly they started before, but formally they are starting right now. And, if the ruling coalition does not get the supermajority, things can be different. And these resistance of the current scheme of democratic transition in the way that it was framed in the 1990s will stay, because the opposition is going to still be a coalition, and it's going probably to stick together. Carlos's report, and again, it's a very good one, and please read it, because it really lays out the things that we need to be discussing about. It considers the divisions within the opposition coalition. And that is, I think, not going to be that important, because the opposition, because we are going to have a majority, no matter what, according to the polls, as the way that I have tried to understand and evaluate the politics of Mexico today from the perspective of political scientists. I see a majority with Claudia. I see a majority with the government of the for the fourth transformation. Not only the poor, not only the left. I mean, because of the pragmatism and the unity Claudia has called for, she has been very, very pragmatic. However, the ruling coalition to survive and to continue with the prerogatives, I'm talking about the party system, you're going to be sticking together. I don't see so much divisions, but they're going to push, and probably they're going to push hard for not to lose their spaces in those institutions.
Thanks, Guadalupe. I'd like to pivot to the economy. And, last year, Mexico had strong economic growth, but it was a large chunk of the growth that there's been in the whole of this administration. Harry, what gives you optimism about the nearshoring situation? The FDI is certainly up, but as a percentage of GDP, it's still not showing a boom, perhaps, that some people might have expected by now. Is it really just a matter of time? And how long can people say that before, maybe start changing your mind about it?
Yeah, so before I do that, Christina, I just want to jump in on the last question for a second about institutions. So one thing I would say about Banxico, it is probably by far and away the best central bank of any central bank in the entire world. And their willingness to act independently of presidential wishes should be a model for everybody in the world. And I think that's really been one of the real strengths of Mexico from a macro stability point of view over many years. And the one thing I would say, one of the most disappointing things that was done in the AMLO administration that really doesn't get enough press is there really was an attack on the bureaucracy throughout the government, where people that I have tremendous respect for were told that their compensation was going down, and after spending a career in government, they couldn't compete, they couldn't be in an industry similar, and their pensions would be at risk if they didn't leave the government. And it created a real outflow of a brain drain from it, and I think it's a very disappointing thing. But so pivoting to the question you asked about the economy.
Yep.
So I've been saying this for 2 years, that the economy is going to be stronger than everybody thinks it's going to be. If you look last year at the beginning of the year, where the economists thought the economy was going to be, 18 months ago, I sat at Amafore and said, this is all going to happen, and everyone was like surprised. And if you look from the beginning to the end, we added the 2% of GDP by the end of the year that at least we expected to come. I think the same thing's going to happen this year. I think people are underestimating the economic impact. FDI is at very, very high levels now. Remittances isn't the same thing, but the remittances continue to be very strong. We can argue whether at the margin some of that is recycling of money that we probably would prefer not to be being remitted to Mexico, but certainly it remains strong. The desire to invest in Mexico is incredibly strong, and I would offer a slightly different view than Guadalupe when we talk about the last administration. I give the AMLO administration very little on nearshoring and foreign investment. I give them very little credit. I would say nearshoring happened despite the intentions of the AMLO administration. I think they get huge marks for macroeconomic stability, and I think they outran most people's expectations. But as a foreigner, I don't feel welcome. When I go to foreign investment, I don't feel like there's a cooperative process taking place. When I hear SAT fiscal reform as not, I prefer raising taxes. My preference is to raise taxes. Enforcement in Mexico is a very complicated issue. Foreigners actually tend to pay their taxes, and enforcement means how can we get more money out of the foreigners? Let's just raise the tax rate. So the policies I don't think have been very investor friendly, and the rhetoric certainly hasn't been investor friendly, and the money's there. When I met with the candidates, I don't even know if I have the book here. I gave them both a book. I'm going to hold it up. I don't know if it's going to, my screen I heard was fuzzy. This is the book I shared with them. I don't know if people can see it or not. It's a book called Do No Harm. And it's a book on brain surgery. And I told them in a very nice note saying, you know, be careful what you do. Because the economy is very complicated. And if you do very little, you're going to benefit tremendously. So to go back to your thing, I think there's going to be a ton of money that comes in. I watch the financial markets, I think, are a scorecard in some ways. The same time I said that the economy was going to go up, the peso was around 20.5, almost 21. And I said, we're going to have a peso below 15 before we're done. I think that's a very good indicator of the direction we're going in. I think the equity market is a good indicator of the direction we're going with. So I would take the position that the process is happening, that the growth is taking place, that we can certainly do a better job on second generation reforms, and there should be a dialogue on what we can do with the microeconomy. I think just putting a sign out that foreigners are either welcome or don't go away would be very productive. And there's some issues that need to be dealt with, like security. You know, maybe we're going to talk about water and infrastructure along the border as one of the conversations. But I think the story is completely intact, and it's playing out according at least to the script that we have, in a very positive way.
Thanks, Harry. I'm conscious of the time. I would love to get onto water and energy as issues, which could be entire panels in and of themselves. But Carlos, just talk a little bit about how big these problems are and what any new government will have to face in both these issues, which are very pressing.
Yes. So both issues are certainly going to be huge topics for the next administration, both energy and water. I mean, we are experiencing definitely two potential significant bottlenecks for that outlook Harry just explained. And the next president will have to take very significant decisions in both areas, political decisions, in order to solve those potential bottlenecks, particularly in energy, but also in water. In energy, Sheinbaum has expressed, let's say, a different view from López Obrador, in the sense that she talks a lot about the possibility of bringing more renewables into the energy matrix. However, she hasn't explained how is she going to do that. And in energy, the politicization that the energy sector has suffered during this past 5 years, she seems to be or either unaware or seems to be compliant and share relatively similar views with AMLO on the politics of the energy sector. What is she going to do with Pemex? What is she going to do with CFE? What is she going to do with the CRE and with, the different participants in this sector? Is she going to open the door to private participation? That means necessarily that CFE and Pemex will have less leverage in the next administration. So that in energy. In water, the problem is relatively similar. I mean, we have had underinvestment in water infrastructure for the past, I would say, not only this administration, but certainly in this administration, the problem exacerbated. And now we are paying the price. Obviously, there are natural issues regarding the lack of water in the country, but there needs to be massive investment in infrastructure, and the next administration doesn't have the money to do that. And at the same time, Sheinbaum has expressed that she doesn't want to do a fiscal reform because clearly a fiscal reform is politically costly. So I will end up saying, Christine, that these two issues are and could be potentially two very significant bottlenecks for nearshoring and for growth potential of Mexico in the coming years if the next administration doesn't really change guard. And to change guard, you need to take political decisions that are going to be costly.
Guadalupe, would you like to come in there on particularly on the politics of energy?
Absolutely. I am much more positive than Carlos and Harry. I consider myself to be a person of the left, and I have not been very happy with this administration's approach to energy because I was expecting more a national approach. And it's very interesting how the government of the fourth transformation have played with this. With Plan Sonora and Claudia has been talking about, really, of course, the greater role of the CFE, of the Federal Commission of Electricity, and the big role of the Petróleos Mexicanos, the construction of a refinery, are part of what Andrés Manuel López Obrador, his nationalist approach to energy politics. However, he has to be playing out with a new context. And Plan Sonora is an important thing. The construction of a desalinization plant in Puerto Peñasco, very sadly, is going to be a very big issue with all the costs for Mexico. But there are going to be pressures. And if the Republican Party wins the election and Donald Trump wins the election, the pressures are going to be enormous. And unfortunately for Mexico, Mexico is a very big country, 12th economy in the world, according to the International Monetary Fund in its 2023 report. 12th biggest economy. Mexico is not a poor country, but compared to the United States, we're very dependent. Therefore, I believe that Mexico and the next government is going to receive a lot of pressure from the United States government that is going to begin in 2024.
I'm conscious of the time. I'd like to give each one of you just a minute at the end to reflect on the key risks going forward, in particular with relation to the US relationship. So whether a Biden administration 2.0 would be just similar to the current relationship, does a potential Trump administration look very different? There's a sense that Trump is a little less focused on Mexico specifically than the first time around. Is that right? Harry, do you want to start?
Sure. I thought I was going to get through this whole session without having to talk about this topic. So I'll say a couple of things. First of all, I'm less worried about Mexico in a Trump administration than I am for the United States and events in the Far East related to China and events in Europe related to Ukraine and Russia and events in the Middle East related to Israel and the Arab countries. I think if Donald Trump were to win the presidency, we wouldn't have to worry as much about Mexico because the other things will be so bad that we can focus on that. That being said, I think we may be positively surprised by the outcome of the U.S. election. We don't know, and we should always keep an open mind. As Carlos says, let's not underestimate the risks of bad things happening. That being said, I believe a Biden 2.0 is going to be worse for Mexico than people think. And I think a Trump, to the extent he spends some time thinking about Mexico, is going to be less problematic for Mexico than people think. Biden's biggest vulnerability is the border. And he is going to have to move very far to the right on that issue. And people will be shocked in Mexico at how, in a successful scenario, what he's going to do between now and the election. And like so many other issues, we've found out that Trump doesn't really have policies. He has hard button issues. How do you energize some people to address their worst fears? And I think the Mexico card just doesn't have the same emotional value to his people that it did in the past. Certainly the border is an issue that needs to be addressed under either administration.
Thanks, Harry. Carlos?
Two messages to conclude. One, the Mexico's political story depends a lot on what happens with Congress, right? As Guadalupe and you have mentioned, if the main scenario case of Integralia is that the Morena probably wins the presidency, although it is still an open possibility, but that's where our probabilities are right now. But Morena doesn't win a supermajority. But if we are wrong and Morena comes close to a supermajority or wins a supermajority, the situation is going to be very different for the country. Now, the second point about the US-Mexico relation. I tend to agree with Harry in the sense that a second Biden administration would be tougher with Mexico than it has been during this first 4 years. So it will not be a piece of cake to have Joe Biden elected for a second term. And we tend to think that he would become a little bit more, a little bit more stricter with Mexico than he has been during his first tenure. And we, again, tend to think that a Trump administration, although certainly we are not back in 2016, I agree with that. This could be a very different administration in that sense, and problems will be higher around the world than in Mexico. Still, Trump would continue to use Mexico as a relatively extortion. He would try to extort Mexico in many different ways, and that will complicate the relation. So we are uneasy about a Trump return, definitely. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Carlos. Guadalupe, to finish.
Very, very fast. I'm also like Harry, not that worried about the result in Mexico, because we kind of know what is going to happen. The first transformation is going to continue in the second phase, but it's going to continue tied to the United States decisions, and the improvements are not in politics of the United States and its role in the world. So we'll see. Mexico is going to be pressured highly. The fentanyl crisis as a narrative and the war against cartels that the Republican Party and the Trump wing of the Republican Party, which is now the Republican Party, is focused more on being strong at the border and with Mexico, and even in its land, in its territory. So Mexico is going to face a number of pressures from the United States, and we're going to depend on the success or not of the United States in the coming years. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Guadalupe, and thank you to all three panelists and to the Wilson Center for organizing this. 2024 is a huge election year all over the world, and it's going to be pivotal for Mexico. And it's not about just which president Mexicans choose, but how it chooses the president, what mandate it gives them, what message they give local leaders, and this will all make up a picture that investors will be digesting in the second half of the year. So our panelists have talked about issues in the economy, security, institutions, some disagreement on the balance of risks and opportunities. But the next leader will take on a fiscal, water, energy, security, long list of challenges and crises that have been building over many years. So thank you so much for listening. Please do feel free to write to us and give us your thoughts or reflections on what we've been discussing, and hopefully we can keep the discussion going. Thank you very much.